Are you hosted? Are you the main moderator?
Um, Either hosted or co-hosted, I
Right.
think.
Oh, yeah.
Michael, you are host,
Our host.
I
Michael.
am the host. All right.
Right.
You could start. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm assuming John will sign back in, but before he does, or while we're waiting, I'll say just a couple of things about this text, although John will be speaking about the beginning part of the introduction. We're going to just cover two parts of the introduction tonight. Up through page 25, we're talking about two of the three aspects in regard to developing bodhicitta that the introduction is based on. The introduction as a whole is based on a verse that's attributed to Nagarjuna that says, "May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be. And where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more." So tonight we'll be talking about that part of the introduction that describes may bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail. And then next week we'll talk about the part of the text that relates to but grow and flourish ever more and more. This is a book, The Way of the Bodhisattva, that
Michael,
is, oh,
shall I take over?
yes,
Sorry,
I was ad-libbing.
my computer crashed. I'm sorry. And are we recording now?
I believe so. It says
Okay.
record.
So
I
I'm
can-
going to be taking the first part of this chapter, first part of the introduction, and then Michael the second. Okay, sorry about that, computer problems. Okay, so I'm not sure what Michael said, but so if I repeat, forgive me, please. We're going through The Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva, who lived from 685 to 763 AD in India. He had a rather interesting life, which I encourage you to read about. The appendices to this book are wonderful, and there's one that gives one of the versions of his life. He was born to a wealthy, if not royal family, but left to pursue the religious path, eventually taking ordination as a monk at the great University of Nalanda, which was the greatest of the Buddhist universities in India. He basically, his life is rather curious. He was regarded by his fellow monks, he became a monk, as being sort of derelict. In fact, they had a name for him, which basically means eats, walks, and I don't know, goofs around. They thought that's all he did. And eventually, some of these monks decided to try and get rid of him. So what they did was they decided to have a situation where a lot of monks were invited to give talks. They figured that when he was invited to give a talk, he would run away. And they erected a big throne for him when his time came, and were very surprised to see him sitting way up high on the throne. He eventually, as he sat there, he gave a talk, and when he got to, which is pretty much the Bodhicharya Avatara, and when he got to the latter part of the text, what's now the text, he ascended off the throne, floated up into the air, and everybody was amazed. So that's a rough recounting of some of the highlights of his life, but you can read about it in the appendix to this translation. It's not quite good. I also encourage you to read all the appendices, they're very good, as well as the footnotes, which are terrific. So, this text is an exposition of the path of the Bodhisattvas, those beings who, turning aside from the futility and suffering of samsara, confusion, nevertheless renounce the peace of an individual salvation, which is what the Hinayana path, the Hinayana stage of the path is all about. And they vow to work for the deliverance of all beings and for themselves to attain supreme enlightenment of Buddhahood for the sake of all other sentient beings so that they can enlighten them. So it's a very selfless and giving and generous intention. So as such, Shantideva's work embodies a definition of compassion raised to its highest power and minutely lays out the methods by which this is to be achieved. It's an overwhelming demonstration of how concern for others, in a love that wholly transcends desire and concern for self, lies at the core of all true spiritual endeavor and is the very heart of enlightened wisdom. Shantideva was a member of the Nalanda monastic community, which, like the communities of Vikramashila, another great monastery, and Odantapuri, was a celebrated center of learning. Legends of him have come down to us over the centuries, giving us a glimpse of a highly unusual and independent, if not eccentric, personality, very much his own master, temperamentally impervious to social and ecclesiastical pressures. He just didn't pay any attention to them, and able to pursue his insights irrespective of conventional expectations and public opinion. He just simply went his way. Drawn at an early age to the teachings of the Mahayana as embodied in the Bodhisattva Manjushri, to whom he was very devoted. Manjushri was the Bodhisattva of wisdom, is the Bodhisattva of wisdom. And so also to the Madhyamaka school. Now the Madhyamaka school will play an important part in the last chapter, the wisdom chapter. Shantideva was very involved or connected to, inspired by the Madhyamaka teachings. Madhyamaka were the teachings of Nagarjuna, who lived in the roughly from around 150 to 250 AD, and who founded this school. It's called the Middle Way School, is the translation of Madhyamaka. And it's really the rationalization and the presentation of emptiness and the proof that all the things which are not emptiness don't make sense and don't exist. So one of the most famous Madhyamaka texts is called the Root Verses on the Middle Way. It's called the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. Karika means verses, Mula means root, and Madhyamaka, of course, means middle way. And in this, Nagarjuna lays out all the arguments for everything we might believe. And I'll just give you one or two examples. All these arguments are very logical. And what they are is really an attack on language and the way language forces us into belief in things, like the belief in me and the belief in you and other, which don't actually exist. So, for instance, I always liked his argument against causation. Supposedly there are two people arguing, the Madhyamakan and the Tirtaka, meaning the heretic. And the Tirtaka asserts that causes produce effects. And so the Madhyamakan says to the Tirtaka in this argument, well, if you assert that causes produce effects, then you have to agree, don't you, that the cause must come either before, simultaneously with, or after the effect. Those are the three possibilities. The Tirtaka agrees. And then the Madhyamakan says, well, of course, it's patently absurd to assert that the cause comes after the effect, because how could it have caused it? And the Tirtaka agrees. And he says, and if it comes at the same time as the effect, simultaneously with it, how can you tell which is which and which caused which? The Tirtaka agrees, waiting for the last shoe to drop. And then the Madhyamakan says, and if you assert that the cause comes before the effect, then it has no connection to the effect. So how could it produce it? Now, the Tirtaka might assert that part of the cause comes simultaneously with the effect, and part of it comes before the effect and has no connection with it. But then we're back to the same two arguments, simultaneity and precedence. So in this way, Nagarjuna proves that there is no such thing as cause and effect. Really, it's just a manner of speech. And he does this with everything you can possibly think of, the existence of a self, beginnings and ends. It just goes on and on with this. In any event, so Shantideva was a great Madhyamakan as well, and not a dry academic. Like Nagarjuna before him, he possessed a remarkable degree, the unusual combination of a powerful intelligence linked with a keen appreciation of the sufferings of the world and a deep sense of tenderness toward others. So this is all expressed in the Madhyamaka Avatara. The Bodhisattva, the Bodhicharya Avatara, which means entering the way of the Bodhisattva. And this text is divided into roughly 3 parts and 10 chapters. The last chapter is just a concluding prayer of dedication. And the other 3 parts are 3 chapters apiece. The first part, chapters 1 through 3, is designed to stimulate the awakening of bodhicitta in the reader's mind, in the student's mind. And it's very inspirational about what bodhicitta is. And the titles of these are The Excellence of Bodhicitta, Confession, and Taking Hold of Bodhicitta. And confession has nothing to do with like a confession of sins. Really what it is the individual acknowledging to him or herself all the neuroses and neuroticisms that we have in our life. And they do it in the form of confession to another person. Part 2 is instructions on how to prevent the precious attitude of bodhicitta from being dissipated. This is chapters 4 to 6. Carefulness, vigilant inspection, introspection, and patience. And part 3, the ways in which bodhicitta may be progressively intensified, chapters 7 through 9. Diligence, meditative concentration, and the very famous chapter on wisdom, which is so powerful, and we're going to be getting to that last. So these 3 divisions, set forth in the introduction, I encourage you to write them down and their themes, so that as you go through the chapters, you'll be reminded of what these sections are about. It will be very helpful, I think. Now, the word bodhicitta in Sanskrit, bodhicitta is a Sanskrit word. Chitta means mind, and bodhi means awake, enlightenment. It's cognate with the word Buddha. The Tibetan for this is Changchup Sempa. Changchup means enlightenment, and Sempa means the mind of, the mind. So it's enlightenment's mind, and Pa is a nominative. It's not a synonym for compassion, as some sometimes think. It's a much broader term in which compassion is contained or implied. And it has 2 aspects, bodhicitta. It's in us, we are it, actually. And the 2 aspects of it are ultimate and relative. Ultimate bodhicitta is a direct understanding of the true state of phenomena, the wisdom of emptiness, shunyata, an immediate non-dual insight that transcends concept. You see the truth of emptiness, that I and other have nothing has any true existence. Everything is a constant and non-existent, but vivid presentation of qualities. And that's the relative truth as well. The relative truth, the aspiration to attain Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings, with practical steps necessary to accomplish this. And it contains within it, this relative truth, immense compassion and appreciation for the beauty of life. Shantideva gradually reveals that ultimate and relative bodhicitta are 2 interdependent aspects of the same thing. This absolute non-existence of phenomena, and yet everything arises, reveals its true nature vividly, and has immense compassion and love in it. Bodhicitta is in fact the true nature and condition of mind, which may be freed from defilement and distraction. Defilement means kleshas, passion, aggression, hatred, stupidity, paranoia, all these things. And it can be freed from that, mind can be freed from that, these defilements which beset it. And the mind is capable of growth and improvement and may be trained. Using dualistic subject and object trainings, as we do, When we work with the breath, we're working with a subject, I, and the breath, other. And this leads us to evolve towards wisdom, our true nature that utterly transcends this dualism. Shantideva shows us the realities of egocentric existence in all its pain and idiocy, and gives us the vision of a sublime alternative, together with practical instructions to realize it. And he really does. When we go through this, it becomes much closer and more realizable. And we, the reader, are really inspired to pursue this path and become what he's describing. He says, indeed, given our immersion in duality, ego, and its objects, wandering in samsara from beginningless time, we can't even remember when it started, our wandering in samsara, and that an impulse towards perfect altruism and forgetting of self can arise at all seems nothing more short of miraculous. Bodhicitta is so extraordinary that its first impulses appear to come from outside, as though they're not part of us, but they are. And there's this quatrain in the first chapter, number 5. Just as on a dark night, black with clouds, the sudden lightning glares and all is clearly shown. Likewise, rarely, through the Buddha's power, virtuous thoughts rise, brief and transient, in the world. And these virtuous thoughts are bodhicitta. Bodhicitta arises like a flash of lightning on a dark night. The first chapter is a rhapsodic celebration, if you hadn't gotten it from that quatrain, of bodhicitta, intended to fill the mind with enthusiasm and inspire it toward this new and wonderful goal. Frankly, I find that the chapters, as they go on and on, become more and more inspiring. Shantideva's method of teaching, which the same one the Buddha used, first encouragement through reflection on the advantages and excellence of the objective, and then a stimulus through meditation on the dire consequences of weakness and backsliding. And he describes the condition that we're in, which we ignore, we try to distract ourselves from, and he's bringing it to the fore so that we're being inspired or motivated both by the whip coming from behind as well as the goal in front of us. The original inspiration and fervor have to be safeguarded and never allowed to disappear. Virtuous thoughts rise, brief and transient, and it is one of the most alarming aspects of spiritual and moral life that insights left unattended and without support will invariably fade. Realizations evaporate. Enthusiasm drains away into the sands of inadvertence and bad habits, old habits. So if we don't keep working at it, it will fade and we'll lapse back into our neurotic lives. It is impossible to embark on the practice of Dharma with great energy and interest, but later, it is possible with great energy and interest, but later, perhaps years later, to turn away empty-handed, with nothing to show for all the time spent. So fear and dread of the consequences of evil, now evil in this sense really means just pain and suffering, are tools as legitimate as those of enthusiasm and encouragement. So it is in this spirit of mental training that Shantideva places before us the fragility of impermanence and the certainty of the horrible realities of death, the possibility, if not probability, of post-mortem suffering in infernal torment, hells, or the hungry ghost realms even, or the animal realms. The lower realms are described in detail. But there is a radical difference with European and Near Eastern versions of religion. In Buddhism, an act is considered evil, not because it is a transgression of a divinely ordained principle laid down by the creator of the universe, God, but because it is productive of suffering in this or future existence. That's what defines evil. Virtue, on the other hand, is that which brings about happiness and tends toward spiritual development. Whether or not we believe in the existence of hells is beside the point. Every evil and unwholesome action simply brings forth suffering, and this is the hell. And it hardly matters whether one conceives of this in the picturesque terms, he says, of Dante's Inferno, or shares the view of Jean-Paul Sartre that hell is other people. If you've ever read Sartre, what was his name of his book? These people trapped in a room forever and ever. And that was hell. So all sufferings, however long, are still subject to the law of impermanence from a Buddhist perspective. And the doctrine of karma has only one message. The experience of states of being follows upon perpetration of acts. We are the authors of our own destiny, and being the authors, we are ultimately, perhaps frighteningly, free. So if we commit acts of generosity and kindness, we will experience love, passion, happiness. And if we commit acts of selfishness and cruelty, we will experience that as well. That Shantideva forces the lower realms on our attention reveals a vital characteristic of his attitude. His constant and overwhelming concern is with the predicament of his fellow beings, which is us. He is ready to confront suffering in all its horrifying reality, and having abandoned all thought for his own comfort and security, he does not draw back in fear or revulsion. He is prepared to accompany us into the pit. He is neither revolted nor depressed, being one who in compassion, quote, will venture into hell of unrelenting pain as swans sweep down upon a lotus lake. That's what he can do. He's utterly courageous because he doesn't really experience the pain himself, because his mind is full of egolessness and compassion. The keynote is courage, time and time again. Compassion emerges not as a sorrowing, tearful state of mind, but as a protective concern that is vibrant with joy and heroic confidence. This is compassion, vibrant with joy and heroic confidence. Not sad, crying, tearful, feeling sad for the object. The second thing to note, the absence of moral comment judgment on the part of Shantideva. He's not judgmental about neurotic, criminal individuals. Where is the justice in this? Shantideva's obvious wish is simply to save from suffering, with no questions asked. That's it. That's what the true compassion of bodhicitta is. We might argue that these monsters deserve punishment. So the strength and impartiality of Shantideva's compassion seems to be subversive of the universal order. And in a sense, they are. They point to a new vision of things, Shantideva's wisdom and compassion, and ultimately grounded, which are ultimately grounded not in the concepts of right and wrong, but in compassion and the wisdom of emptiness. So Buddhism focuses on freeing everybody from samsara, everybody, no matter how evil. I remember one of the Buddha's disciples, I forget his name meant garland of skulls. I forget what it was in Sanskrit. And what it was is he was a murderer. Oh, garland of fingers it was. He was a murderer. And when he killed somebody, he would cut off their fingers and string them on a necklace that went around his neck. Ultimately, he got enlightened. In samsara, the mind conditioned by the three poisons, ignorance, attraction, and aversion, can only respond egocentrically to situations. Samsara's, Shantideva's unconditional compassion draws our attention to the fact that the law of karma does not amount to a theory of human justice. Neither does it provide the basis for feelings of moral outrage or ethical superiority. In samsara, there can be no completely innocent victims. Buddhism teaches that the object of compassion is simply suffering itself. It would, after all, be absurd to withdraw compassion from the guilty, so-called, and reserve it only for the worthy, so-called, those assumed to be morally innocent, for the simple reason that in samsara there are no worthy objects of compassion. For Shantideva, everybody's corrupt in one degree or another, self-centered. For Shantideva, since suffering is all pervasive, all beings at all times, and regardless of circumstances, are worthy of it. So the vow of the Bodhisattva to deliver beings from suffering, meaning from the cause of their suffering, and the job is to teach, to show the way. First, by revealing values to be adopted or abandoned. That's one thing the Bodhisattva does, is teaches us what values to adopt and which to throw away. And thus the means whereby wholesome and propitious existential states are produced. And then by teaching the wisdom whereby samsara is wholly transcended. So first, he teaches us how to be better people, more virtuous, so that we have better lives, happier lives. And then ultimately teaches us the wisdom to transcend good and bad altogether. This is the definition of Dharma, Shantideva's liberating message to the world. His teaching is profoundly optimistic. If suffering is the fruit of thought and action, it can be avoided. The realization that we are in a position to change ourselves and so shape our destiny logically leads to confession, the subject of Shantideva's second chapter. But this isn't a matter of breastbeating or exaggerated feelings of guilt. In Buddhism, confession is to be understood principally in the sense of open acknowledgement, primarily to oneself, of past behavior. It is only when we become conscious of our former actions and behavior patterns that they can be changed and a new direction taken. So if you go to a daton or even a wikton, you will be given a meditation instructor. And one of the purposes of that relationship with your meditation instructor is that every morning you'll take the vows, or not, as you choose. But if you take a vow and then break it during the day, you have to go to your meditation instructor and confess. And this confess is not a matter of confessing guilt or sin with great feelings of self-attack and guilt. Rather, it's bringing your actions to awareness. So one of the examples I use is that, you take the vow not to take what isn't offered to you. But in the morning, you go into the shower and you forgot your soap, and somebody left their soap sitting in the shower. And so you figure, what the heck, nobody's looking, and you use that other person's soap. You've broken the vow, and you're enjoined then to go to your meditation instructor and confess. And the meditation instructor isn't going to say, oh, now you have to do 10 Hail Buddhas and feel very guilty. They're just going to listen. This is blah, blah, blah. So while Shantideva declares his guilt to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, he does not ask them for forgiveness. That's not the point. They are invoked as protectors and the supreme witnesses of his self-disclosure and resolve. It is in their presence that an old course comes to an end and a new one begins. And so, borne on the wave of elation and confidence, supported by the glorious vision of the attainments of the Buddhas and great beings of the past, this is us and him, spurred by the realization that time is short, and boy is it ever, and stakes high, Shantideva is impelled in chapter 3 toward commitment to the Bodhisattva path. In words that have since become the standard formula in the Tibetan tradition for the taking of the Bodhisattva vow. And here are stanzas 23 and 24 from this chapter 3. Just as all the Buddhas of the past have brought forth the awakened mind, and in the precepts of the Bodhisattvas step by step abode and trained, likewise, for the benefit of beings, I will bring to birth the awakened mind, and in those precepts, step by step, I will abide and train myself. So Michael, take it away.
Okay, so let me begin by referring to previous text that we read by Trolloc Rinpoche. I think most people here participated in that class because I think he makes an important distinction that's very relevant, in particular to the chapters that I'll be talking about tonight. If you remember in Mahamudra, if I'd thought of it earlier, I would have copied into my notes, but I have to read directly from the book. If you remember in Mahamudra, we relate to thoughts without judgment, without any sense of good or bad or anything we want to cultivate or not, because in the practice of meditation, that generates agitation and further conceptualization. But in the context of Mahamudra practice, so too with the Mahamudra teachings, we have to view karmic process in exactly this way during our everyday activities, for it's imperative that we increase everything positive and reduce everything negative, destructive, and debilitating in our lives. And that's what we're talking about as a relative practice in our daily life. In the context of Mahamudra practice itself, it's different because we're concerned purely with contemplation, not action. But in this case, we are talking about our activity, not simply in meditation, but more so in post-meditation. A lot of what Shantideva is talking about, particularly in the chapters 4, 5, and 6, carefulness, vigilant introspection, and patience, is how we conduct ourselves in the world. The basis for that is our meditation practice, but it's really what we carry out of our meditation practice and what we come to understand in our meditation practice that leads us to realize that there are states of mind that are conducive to liberation, conducive to positive outcomes, and states of mind, let alone activities, that will bring further harm to us and further harm to other beings. And so we're not talking about what we do in the context of formal meditation itself, so much as how we conduct ourselves in the rest of our lives, what we bring out into the post-meditation experience. And before I go into that, I just wanted to say something more about bodhicitta, because I looked at, as I was preparing for tonight's talk, I looked back on some notes from the Mahayana text by Trungpa Rinpoche, that we read. And he does say there that in the discussion of Mahayana, we have not talked about anything that we do not already have or that we need to crank up. We've been discussing qualities that we have. We just need to realize that we have them. You do have to dispel problems, and that is a big part of what we're going to be talking about, not tonight, and as we read through the chapters. You do have to dispel problems, but beyond dispelling problems, you don't have to crank up anything. You don't need to create anything artificially or manufacture anything. So that's just to give some context into what we're talking about in terms of the chapters 4, 5, and 6, which again, in terms of the verse in the beginning about bodhicitta, relate to, and where it has arisen, may it never fail. So we're talking about learning to guard our bodhicitta. As it says in the introduction, that we need to, that our inspiration, our bodhicitta inspiration, our bodhisattva vow needs consolidation. Now, I will say that the chapters 4 and 5, on carefulness and vigilant introspection, relate primarily to the paramita of discipline, whereas you could say the earlier chapters that John talked about relate much more with generosity. But in this case, we're talking about discipline, which when we read about discipline in the Bodhisattva Path text, Trungpa Rinpoche says discipline is connected with Vipassana. So there's very much a quality of what we're able to see, what we're able to understand. And we begin looking at this chapter on carefulness, as the book says, that there's both good news and bad news in a sense. But really what this chapter is trying to do, actually what the entire book is trying to do, but this chapter in particular, is make it crystal clear to us the reality that we're in. We may begin having taken this vow, having developed this inspiration to work for the benefit of all beings. And then, as Shantideva says, we may hesitate, we may feel overwhelmed. But he also makes the positive point that it is possible with effort. And he also then goes through what it means if we should fail, if we should give up on or abandon sentient beings. That the consequences, so there are consequences of failing, and then there is also a possibility of achieving, ultimate Buddhahood. And that in essence, failing would mean continuing to cycle through samsara, continuing to go through cycles of birth and rebirth in all kinds of realms, in all kinds of situations. As in some ways, you could look at chapter 4 on carefulness as, in part, a contemplation of the 4 reminders that we recite in every practice. That first of all, we have this precious human birth. That secondly, it won't last forever. We're not immortal. We will die someday, sooner or later, and we don't know when. That we do create karma, and that because of that, when death comes, we'll be helpless. We'll be at the mercy of the momentum of whatever karma we've created in our lives. And then finally, looking at the unsatisfactory nature of samsara. That even the best of samsara, at best, is temporary. Or as one teacher used to say, it's happiness with an expiration date. Let alone the tremendous suffering that we can experience in samsara. And Shantideva goes through some of those possibilities when he talks about the hell realms and some of the other lower realm existences with their utter misery. And where the intensity of the realm struggle, the intensity of the emotionality, the intensity of the torment is so great that there's hardly a gap. So that it's important to appreciate the possibility in our current precious human birth for the fact that we can open up, that that the intensity of the struggles in the human realm is not so great that we can experience a gap, that we can allow ourselves to open up. So in understanding this, it's really important, I think, to approach this material with a perspective of now. And by that, I mean now in terms of personally to each one of us, what do these things mean? And that's why the verses read, "For it's as if by chance that I have gained this state so hard to find, wherein to help myself, this state being this precious human birth. If now, while having such discernment," and again, this comes back to just utter clarity about what our situation really is. It's not a question, certainly we could hear it this way, that we're talking about some myth about some future state that we might fall in, heaven and hell and so on. But if we actually look at our in this moment experience, we can see how at times we engage in actions that we later deeply regret. We do things that bring ourselves harm. We've found ourselves in situations where we're miserable, even if it isn't the eons in the hell realms or the hungry ghost realms that the teachings talk about. We can see the possibilities and the realities in our own lives. For it's as if by chance that I have gained this state so hard to find, wherein to help myself, if now, while having such discernment, I am once again consigned to hell. So again, that's the risk. That's what we have to realize is a very real possibility if we don't continue to work with ourselves. And again, the idea isn't that there's some external being that's bearing down on us or, some kind of eternal damnation of some kind that we have to fear because we did something wrong at some point. It's not a question of original sin. We can literally look at it in terms of our psychological states from day to day and the kinds of states of mind that we find ourselves in. And then he asks in this chapter, how is it, given the potential that we have in this life, that we sometimes do just drift into mindlessness, distraction, confusion, engage in activities that are, so harmful. And again, in this chapter on carefulness, he says, I am as if benumbed by sorcery, as if reduced to total mindlessness. I do not know what dulls my wits. Oh, what is it that has me in its grip? And then he answers in the next verse. It's the kleshas, anger, lust, these enemies of mine, passion, aggression, and ignorance. And he says, when you actually look at the nature of passion, aggression, and ignorance, when we actually look at the nature of the kleshas, that as he says, they're limbless and devoid of faculties. They have no bravery, no cleverness. How have they reduced me to such slavery? And the answer is they dwell within our minds, that we have come to, although we can recognize when we look that places are just thoughts, that these emotions are just fleeting experiences, intangible, in a sense, ungraspable. But how do they come powerful? It's because we allow them to do so. They're powerful in one sense and absolutely powerless in another. And Trungpa Rinpoche, in The Path of Individual Liberation, talked about pretty much the same experience. This is from the chapter on the power of flickering thoughts, where he said when we project ourselves into a situation or into a particular world, we begin with a very small and minute shift of attention. And from that, things become enlarged and exaggerated. Sudden dramas such as murdering somebody or creating immense chaos begin on the level of minute concepts and tiny shifts of attention. The first little hint of dislike or attraction for somebody eventually escalates and brings on a much more immense scale of emotional drama or psychodrama. So the point of this chapter on carefulness is to really see that the arena is the mind itself. That Shantideva points out how we're willing to bear all kinds of hardships for less important external things, the conventional realities in the world, but are often less willing to deal with whatever hardship there is in terms of working with our own minds. And yet we come to understand that our destiny lies, as it says in the introduction, that our destiny lies in the way we're able to order the workings of our mind. It also points out how Shantideva uses pride as an antidote to our tendency to become complacent or discouraged, that we can actually rouse ourselves. And altogether in this chapter, he really stresses the degree to which the defilements, the kleshas, passion, aggression, and ignorance, coming to understand them as enemy. This is very much like teaching that I heard once by Khandro Rinpoche, where he talked about the fact that too often we come to identify with the kleshas, and we think the kleshas actually work for us, that we think that we have some kind of power, or through becoming angry, or that we'll ultimately get what we want through engaging in passion, or that we can numb ourselves out with ignorance and somehow get through life that way. And what Shantideva is doing in this chapter on carefulness, which we'll see when we read through verse by verse, is really making it clear the degree to which the kleshas, primarily passion, aggression, and ignorance, this way of relating to the world, ultimately bring suffering, and the way in which they truly reduce us to misery when we're unclear about them. So the point here is that once we become clear that the problem is the mind, in other words, how we relate to our experience, how we relate to what comes up in our day-to-day life, then we're faced with the simple, as it says in the introduction, the simple but difficult task is to become more aware of how thoughts emerge and develop. And this is the material involved in chapter 5, vigilant introspection. And again, this chapter, carefulness, and this chapter, vigilant introspection, really relate to the paramita of discipline primarily. So we're talking about developing mindfulness awareness and learning to rest in awareness as best we can, as much as we can, particularly in our post-meditation life here. So the good news in in terms of the vigilant introspection chapter is that the mind can be trained, that we can tame our minds. And this is the quote, near the beginning of that chapter. If with mindfulness as rope, the elephant of mind is tethered all around, our fears will come to nothing, and every virtue will drop into our hands. So we're talking about developing the very basic discipline of shamatha vipassana, being able to settle with our experience, being able to allow ourselves to not be so reactive, not be so caught up in our dramas and struggles and emotionality, and actually settle enough to begin seeing how our minds work, how things work in the world around us, and developing this kind of clarity. developing primarily Vipassana awareness, being able to rest in awareness so that we're aware of what we're feeling, we're aware of what we're experiencing, and we have some sense of being able to work more skillfully with the world around us. In the chapter on discipline and the Bodhisattva path, Trungpa Rinpoche says that the analogy for discipline is that of the wish-fulfilling jewel, because it is the basis of all virtues, which is exactly what Shantideva says. If with mindfulness as rope, the elephant of mind is tethered all around, our fears will come to nothing. Every virtue drops into our hands. Trungpa Rinpoche says, without discipline, your preoccupations become much more intense. You're much more involved, more frustrated, and busy with the complexities of your own neuroses. You could recreate realms and manifest them in all sorts of ways. Discipline is said to be the basis of all virtues because of the evenness of temper, the evenness of existence, and the trustworthiness of experience it produces. You do not organize your life purely according to your moods. Your senses are controlled, and you create predictability for yourself and others. So, in other words, with mindfulness as rope, the elephant of mind is tethered all around. That we find that through meditation practice, we're able to settle ourselves, that we're able to see with greater awareness and rest in the greater space of awareness, and not be so uneven in our experience. In terms of the tethering the elephant of mind, Shantideva actually begins that chapter by pointing out how the untamed elephant of mind can drag us right to hell. And again, if we look at our experience, not thinking so much of hell as some external destination, but look at our states of mind, look at how we can fly into a rage or become so upset or irritated and then say hurtful things that we regret later or do destructive things that we regret later, then we know exactly what he means when he says this elephant of mind can drag us to hell. So anyway, the importance here, this chapter really emphasizes the importance of practice and mindfulness awareness meditation. As Shantideva says, for all anxiety and fear and pain and boundless quality, their source and wellspring is the mind itself. So by settling the mind, learning to work with our minds, we develop the awareness that allows us to have a choice rather than just giving in to the momentum of our habits and the momentum of our emotions and the momentum of our, the elephant of our mind when it's untethered. I'll say this, there are verses in this text that I still struggle to understand. There are other verses that are just incredibly profound, and you could give an entire talk on just a single verse. In this chapter on vigilant introspection, he says at one point, to cover all the earth with sheets of leather, where could such amounts of skin be found? But with the leather soles of just my shoes, it is as though I cover all the earth. So what he's talking about here, and again, I've heard teachers talk at great length about the fact that conventionally, samsaric logic is that we need to create perfect circumstances around us, that we're always struggling to, again, through passion, aggression, and ignorance, take in and hold on to the things that we find pleasurable and good, push away or fight against the things that are bad, and numb ourselves and ignore the things that don't matter to us. And in that sense, we're bound to experience frustration. We're bound to experience difficulty because circumstances constantly change. And the point here is, and this is what this particular verse means when it says how to cover all of the earth with sheets of leather. There's no way that we could possibly create and maintain a perfect world no matter what happens around us. But if we can work with our minds and settle our minds so that we're, again, in even placement, as Trungpa Rinpoche said, evenness of existence, evenness of temper, trustworthiness of experience that meditation produces, then it's as if we were wearing shoes and had leather wherever we went. And as I say, I've heard entire talks based on just this idea that really drive home. Again, not that it's something that we need to think about perhaps so much in a conceptual way, but just come to realize with clarity that it's true, that this is actually the very clear, stark statement about things as they are. So, as it says in the introduction, the essential problem is that we're often not aware of what's in our minds, or we only become aware of thoughts and when thoughts and feelings develop with so much momentum and intensity that we're powerless to stop them. As Shantideva will say in this chapter, lack of introspection, or I could say lack of awareness, lack of introspection is a thief. It slinks behind when mindfulness abates. So the point in this chapter is we need to guard our mind, which we do by developing awareness, mindfulness awareness meditation, and being open to moments of awareness, gaps as they occur in daily life that we come to increasingly become more familiar with through meditation practice and more able to rest in when they do occur. And with this, as we become increasingly aware of our experience in the moment, that, as it says in the introduction, the slightest impulse to negativity should be stopped. Or as Shantideva says, be like a log, rather than we should continue to feed it with further thoughts, further resentments, further, whatever it is, further desires, or even worse, actually act on it. That we should actually see, we become increasingly able to see the kleshas as they arise. And I know people have had this experience because we've heard people in discussion group talk about becoming less reactive at times as a result of meditation practice. And that's exactly what this chapter is talking about, the importance of vigilant introspection, being aware of our states of mind, being aware of how thoughts lead to further thoughts and further actions if we don't, tether the untamed elephant of mind with mindfulness. So be like a log. And then there are also verses in this chapter that relate specifically to mind's identification with body, our attachment to comfort, and so on. Bringing up the point that, in fact, that all of this preoccupation, again, not that we shouldn't take care of ourselves, and it's not to go to one extreme to the other. That's the kind of binary thinking that we, again, read about in Chalak Rinpoche's book that doesn't help. But that we could be less attached, less preoccupied with things that are less important. And again, come to appreciate the importance of developing a mindfulness awareness through regular meditation practice so that we are able to have some choice and some influence over our experience. So, and this leads to the next chapter, chapter 6, on patience, which is, speaking personally, one of my favorite chapters in the whole book, because I have had cause to work with this chapter and reference this chapter when, in my working life, I worked with, in the school, as some of you know, with kids with trauma histories and all kinds of emotional disturbances and psychiatric disturbances. So there is often a great deal of aggression directed my way. And it's really important to develop a sense of patience. So the main thing here with patience, and this is again the patience paramita as well, the main thing here, the main thing we're protecting ourselves from is the unbridled anger and aggression. As the chapter begins, all the good works gathered in 1,000 ages, a single act of anger shatters them. And this chapter 6 on patience goes on to say, no evil is there similar to anger, no austerity compared with patience. Some translations I've read will actually say no virtue compared with patience. But I can see why they use the word austerity, because one aspect of this chapter, and there's a great deal of depth in it, but one aspect of the chapter is developing the skill to be able to bear with difficulty without aggression. And in that sense, it is an austerity. We are having to learn something about ourselves and how to refrain from habitual or conventional responses. Trungpa Rinpoche, by the way, says exactly the same thing about aggression. Again, from the Bodhisattva Path book. Aggression is the most dangerous emotion because it does not allow any form of gentleness. Passion and lust may have qualities of neurosis, and they may destroy your mindfulness and awareness, but at the same time, they have the nature of acceptance. However, aggression is based on total rejection, whether it is aggression toward yourself or aggression toward other sentient beings. When we're angry, we have no connection with the Dharma at all. So this is what the patience chapter is about, how to help us learn to deal with aggression when it comes toward us, how to deal with our own aggression and anger in response, or how to be, as it says in the text, how to behave in a hostile environment. And in order to do this, the first thing we have to do is, again, notice what we're experiencing, which is why the previous chapters on carefulness and vigilant introspection are so important. If we're not aware of what we're feeling, we're just going to react. We're going to give in, and then we'll do things that we regret, things that cause harm, things that lead to further difficulties for everyone. So this chapter actually does quite a bit, and it's very profound. I am actually reading a book about this chapter called Peaceful Heart by Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche, and as many times as I've read this chapter, I'm finding even more things that I didn't understand before. So let's just say that the patience chapter first looks at the sources and nature of anger, the kinds of things that feed it. Quite literally, Shantideva will talk about the things that literally are food for anger. And this basically connects to the 8 worldly dharmas and our experience of those. Actually, Dzigar Kongtrul points out that there are 72 possibilities here, but it's less daunting than it sounds. So the 8 worldly dharmas are pain and pleasure, praise and blame, gain and loss, and I think fame and infamy, but I might not be quite right on that one. Let me cheat. Pleasure and pain, gain and loss, praise and blame, and he calls it fame or good reputation, or lack of fame. And the idea is that basically, as you'll see as we read through this chapter, that each one of these leads to agitation and dissatisfaction, if not outright anger. So you have 8 possibilities in terms of either not getting what we want in terms of pleasure, gain, fame, or getting what we don't want in terms of pain and infamy and blame and so on. So those are 8 possibilities. And then not only do we become upset and angry when we have these experiences ourselves, but we can become angry if they happen to someone that we like or love. We can be just as upset, become just as angry, just as irritated, just as frustrated when somebody we care about, or even somebody we identify with, even political figures who we have no real direct relationship with in terms of personal relationship. We can become upset if they experience gain when we don't want them to, or when they don't gain when we do want them to, and so on and so forth. So it can be, so those are 24 possibilities right there for ourselves, for people that we love, and then also for people that we don't like in terms of, not getting and not getting. And then the way it gets to 72 is by looking at past, present, and future. We can become upset about experiences we've had in the past where we didn't gain or lost, or we were praised, or we were blamed, or we had a good reputation or developed a bad reputation with somebody. We can be experiencing it in the present, and we can imagine these things happening in the future. And not only can we imagine it for ourselves, we can imagine it for the people we care about and for the people that we don't. So altogether, that multiplies out to 72 possibilities of what we can experience in terms of anger and aggression by becoming involved in the 8 worldly dharmas. And a great deal of this chapter really relates to how trivial and foolish some of these preoccupations can be. In the beginning of the chapter on patience, he actually talks a great deal about developing a mindset where we can bear with a certain amount of difficulties. And he talks about learning to maintain a cheerful state of mind, not giving into samsaric agitation and dissatisfaction, which is the food for anger. And why does he say this, or how does he say this? He says, dejection never brings me what I want. My virtue will be warped and marred by it. If there's a remedy when trouble strikes, what reason is there for dejection? And if there's no help for it, what use is there in being glum? So the point is to develop our ability to bear difficulties without aggression, without reactivity. And a lot of the rest of the chapter really, on patience in particular, For those of you who are, especially those of you who are trained as therapists, really I could say is a great deal of very similar to cognitive behavioral therapy, in that he looks at the kind of erroneous thinking that leads to anger, the ways in which we identify with things when we don't have to, the way in which we project things that we don't have to, the way that we imagine things that we don't have to, and get ourselves worked up. And a great deal of the chapter also involves reframing how we understand our own anger, how we understand the aggression of others, and looking at the ways in which our thinking is erroneous, up to even developing some sense of the emptiness of holding on to a solid identity about ourselves and someone else, how a solid view of I and other based on aggression in particular is illusory, and that if we actually are able to not be so reactive and actually look at the situation and analyze the situation carefully, we begin to see the emptiness of our anger, the emptiness and futility of our anger. And again, just as a simple reframe, a different way of understanding the same situation. And I'm mentioning this because it is one that when I train staff in the school where I worked and try to help people become less reactive to some of the aggression, especially verbal aggression that they were experiencing, I would point out, I would actually paraphrase what I'm about to read from Shantideva. Because a lot of times people just would say, I shouldn't have to expect this kind of behavior from somebody else. And the point that Shantideva makes is that sentient beings harm themselves. Why in the world would we think they would treat us better? Or actually, quite literally, this is the verse. Some hang themselves or leap into the void, take poison. For when affliction seizes them, they even slay themselves, the selves they love so much. So how can they not be the cause of others' bodily distress? So that as we understand this, we come to understand other people's aggression, not with a sense of anger, but with a sense of compassion, that for them, the elephant of their mind has dragged them to hell, and that they're helpless, that they perhaps haven't had the precious human birth that we've had, or at least we have some opportunity to develop some discipline and have a practice that helps us develop the ability to actually see what we experience and maybe make different choices. So the analysis of anger and the analysis of aggression that is so much a part of this chapter actually ends with the point that enemies and these negative experiences are precisely what give us the opportunity to free ourselves of ego clinging. They're exactly the experiences that give us the opportunity to develop patience and non-aggression. This is directly related to the Lojong slogan, be grateful to everyone. The way that Shantideva puts it, the verse that's quoted in the introduction is, they, like Buddha's very blessing, bar my way, determined as I am to plunge myself headlong to sorrow. How can I be angry with them? That it's precisely through interaction and these experiences where we do encounter aggression that we're able to develop our capacity for non-aggression and patience and being able to respond skillfully rather than reactively. And that so we should be grateful for these experiences. I can't say that that's always how I feel, but I understand the logic at least. I'll also just say to close that when Trungpa Rinpoche talked about patience, again in the Bodhisattva Path book, that he talked about 3 types of patience, which again parallel exactly what we're talking about here with what we're describing in terms of the patience chapter. The first was overcoming other people's destructiveness. In other words, being able to not relate to other people's hostility with our own hostility, with our own aggression, not reacting with just habitual reactiveness. So that's the first one. The second one is realizing the nature of other people's aggression. And that's exactly what Shantideva is talking about in terms of the analysis that we go through in chapter 6, of coming to understand our own aggression and also the nature of aggression that we experience in other people. And then the final aspect of patience that Trungpa Rinpoche talked about was individually examining. So clearly, looking at ourselves, doing the kind of analysis and reflection that Shantideva will be talking about in this chapter. So by doing these things, by practicing and both in formal meditation, but also more importantly in post-meditation practice, carefulness and vigilant introspection, and developing our capacity for patience or non-aggression, that's precisely how we guard bodhicitta once it has arisen. So with that, I think I'm done, and we have time for any discussion, questions and answers. Maybe sitting a moment in vigilant introspection. Paul?
First, I'd just like to say thank you so much. That was beautiful, very enriching and enlightening. Just going back to the beginning, I just had a couple of questions, and they don't jive with all that beautiful stuff, the part just now. So initially, John had mentioned that when Shantideva was speaking and on the throne, and he arose up and ascended into the air. When I read or hear of those statements like that, should I take them figuratively or metaphorically? Like he rose in consciousness, or should I see it as a overcoming of the physical laws of gravity?
I just take it as an expression of devotion. I sort of personally, I doubt that he actually floated up into the air, but how do I know? I guess miracles are possible. But I take those kinds of things. I've read them before in other contexts, Buddhist contexts, similar kinds of descriptions. So I just take it as an expression of devotion, awe, appreciation for the teachings.
Yeah.
Personally.
Well, as in my time studying Hinduism, they talked about the mystics, and magic carpets and stuff like that. I wasn't sure, but your explanation seems a lot more appropriate. Brings it closer to here now. What's important. In the past, attaining enlightenment was said to take eons, lifetimes. Reading the book of some Mahamudra books, they say it can be done with a 9-to-5 job and taking care of a family, just depending upon how it's applied or the amount of time one actually spends doing it, how effective one is. Can you speak to that? Eons of time or lifetimes versus actually getting it done this time around or right here and now?
Well, when you study the higher teachings, higher so-called, like Mahamudra or Great Perfection, Dzogchen in the Nyingma sect, they often say that if you practice the Hinayana teachings, it will take you many, many, many lifetimes to achieve enlightenment. If you practice the Mahayana teachings, it will take much fewer lifetimes, but still multiple. When you practice the lower tantras, it can be done in a very few number of lifetimes. And if you practice Mahamudra or Dzogchen, it can be done in one lifetime. They're just extolling the superiority of the different techniques. But it's more than that, I think. These techniques and these teachings are definitely more sophisticated as you go along. And I think they take you faster into the path and along the path. That's my feeling about it personally. And I I'm going right along with my teachers in that. Michael, do you have something?
I'd pretty much say the same thing. I think that the Vajrayana teachings, Mahamudra and Dzogchen, are very direct, and that's why they talk so much about the importance of recognition and realization right on the spot. The Hinayana and Mahayana teachings are more oriented in some ways toward remedying, removing some of the obstacles to recognition. And so they're very helpful and, and essential for most of us, because we are obscure. We are not able to directly recognize the true nature of mind in Mahamudra or, the nature of, Rigpa in, the Dzogchen teachings. So I find it all helpful. Of course, the Mahamudra teachings also say that thinking about some enlightenment way in the future or fearing that it'll never happen, that's actually an obstacle to practice. So there's that.
Just a thought. It's just a thought.
Yeah, and it just again, it leads to more agitation of mind or some fixation on some kind of imagined goal, as opposed to just simply being able to settle into reality.
Personally, I've been a Dzogchen practitioner for, well, at least 25 years, if not more. But yet, I'm in love with this text. It's so powerful and so useful and so instructive that I think it really will help us move along the path much faster, in spite of the fact that this is supposedly a Mahayana text. But you have to realize, too, the ultimate sort of teaching of both Mahamudra and Dzogchen is that we already are enlightened. So there is no path, Well, Shantideva is saying that our nature is enlightenment, bodhicitta, awakened mind, So it's very in tune with these higher teachings. This text is just stunning, I think, myself.
Thank you.
Yeah. Who else? I can't see the whole panoply of people, so Michael, you'll have to identify people who have their hands up. The fact that he gives us a way to look at difficult situations, like someone who's attacking us or being mean to us, as part of the path. Michael, can you sum that up again? What Shantideva says about that?
Well, there's a lot of different things that he says about it. I mean, part of it is he asks us, he asks us to look at the nature of anger and look at our part in it. He asks us to look at exactly what we're angry at and how sensible that is. He asks us to look at what the consequence of engaging in angry action is. And to look at what the possibility is or what we develop when we're able to not react, in a habitual way or conventional way. Go ahead.
But he also describes these very painful situations as opportunities, tremendous opportunities for us to awaken. He says, he recommends that as soon as we feel the urge to do anything, speak, or even to walk across the room, we should get into the habit of self-scrutiny. The slightest impulse to negativity should be greeted with a total paralysis of the system. Quote, it's then that like a log you should remain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, refrain from negative actions. Judith?
Judith, you're muted.
Still muted. Wait a
That
There you go.
that I love the positivity and the hopefulness. Although hope is something I'm not too in favor of, along with the Buddhist attitude. But it's just a kind of exciting way to look at experience, and he's so positive and so encouraging.
Hmm.
The positivity is so encouraging. That's what I love about it. Excited to read more.
Let me read a section here that I find so inspiring myself. See what you think. This is on the small edition, page 18, and it starts right at the top. The essential problem which a moment's reflection on experience will confirm is not that defilements occur within our minds, anger, lust, hatred, but that 9 times out of 10, we are not aware that they are there. We're asleep. We're living the dream, you know. We don't even know we're dreaming. Or rather, by the time they obtrude, these defilements, upon our waking consciousness, they have usually acquired such dimensions and strength that in the ordinary run of things, we are powerless to prevent their consequences.
Yeah.
The sudden outburst of destructive anger, the lustful impulse, the cruel or arrogant word that can have life-changing consequences, must have had their source, perhaps a long time previously, in a momentary flash of impatience or desire that, had it been adverted to at the time, might easily have been neutralized and dispelled. But we're asleep when we do these things. All very well, but how precisely is one to become so perfectly self-possessed that no impulse of the mind, however slight, is able to pass unnoticed? Alas, there are no magical solutions. The technique prescribed by Shantideva is that of constant, unrelenting vigilance, a continuous advertence to what is happening within the inner forum. He says that we should guard our minds with the same care with which we would protect a broken or wounded arm while moving through an unruly crowd. Now, there's an image. We should protect our minds in the same way that we would protect our broken or wounded arm while we're moving through an unruly crowd. And here again, the educative methods of fear and encouragement have their place. Shantideva recommends that as soon as we feel the urge to do anything, to speak, or even to walk across the room, we should get into the habit of self-scrutiny. The slightest impulse to negativity should be greeted with a total paralysis of the system. I mean, we're asleep through so much of our lives, dreaming. That person said this to me, I'm going to say that to them, and whatever it might be. Don't even know we're doing it.
I know I'm doing it.
We all catch ourselves sometimes.
Philip.
Thank you both. That was great. Yeah, to follow up on what you're saying, John and Judith, one of the things he hits on over and over again is to catch them while they're small, right? We have a tendency always to think, I'm overwhelmed by my anger, or this emotion is so powerful, I'm unable to do anything with it. But on page 16, he points out, he says, and yet these kleshas, however terrible they may be in their effects, are nothing more than thoughts, intangible, fleeting mental states.
Mhm.
There's nothing to them. And if we can learn to be aware enough to pick them up while they're small enough so that we could effectively deal with them, the world would be a better place.
There again, as I said before, when I would do training where I used to work, I would talk to people about exactly that, trying to catch things while they're small, because when they develop momentum, it gets much harder to stop them. And as it happened one year, we'd done a trip out to Niagara Falls, and I was looking at the river before the falls and thinking about I can understand people going over, I wouldn't do it, but I can understand somebody as a daredevil doing some kind of a wild thing to go over Niagara Falls, that how it could happen accidentally, which it does happen. That was the thing that I was trying to understand. And remember looking at the river, and when you're back from the falls, it's very peaceful, slowly flowing river. And I could imagine somebody thinking, well, this is not a big deal, until they get to a point where it's not so slow anymore. And now there's a real power to it. And they do want to get out, but they can't, because the flow is, and I think that's exactly why, what it is, why it's important to catch things when they're small. Or like Trungpa Rinpoche said, sudden dramas such as murdering someone or creating immense chaos begin on the level of minute concepts and tiny shifts of attention. And it's like, the more we're aware of our minds and the more we see how one thing leads to another, the more we can catch things before they develop so much intensity that they're impossible or really difficult to stop.
We are at the end, 6:59. I can't put the chants up. Is there someone else who can? My computer crashed and I'm on a laptop.
I can probably put them up long enough to do it. Let me just hold on.
Maybe I could.
Want me to do it?
Oh, if you,
Sure.
Okay.
Would you like me to do the chants? Okay, I'm
Yes,
sorry.
please. Sorry, I was waiting for you.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
We will end with a prayer for peace and by dedicating the merit earned by our practice to the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world. And may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
And for next week, by the way, we're going to finish the introduction. And I encourage you to read the appendices as well as the foreword and the translator's introduction. They're very short, but the appendices are good. And we'll discuss all that.